This video has been 20 years in the making. My favorite movies ever made came out 2 decades ago today.
It is time.
So yeah, let's look back at one of the key female characters in the story and discuss how her role holds up these days. Magovanen, Milleen. This is More Than a Love Interest, the show where we talk about the arcs of female characters in film. Today, we are talking about Arwen and Domiel in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. First, we are going to talk about her level of agency, especially in comparison to the book. Then we will talk about the journey she goes on in the films, and finish up with whether or not she is more than a love interest. Let's get started. So, to start this off, let's talk about how much agency Arwen has in the story overall. And because this is taken directly from a book, unlike the other ladies I've discussed, I think it is important to consider the constraints of attempting a faithful adaptation before we jump into the movie.
Where to begin?
This is not a book-to-film adaptation channel, but allow me just this once to do an in-depth comparison between the book and the films. I've put the moments on screen of when Arwen is mentioned in the text, so let's go through them one by one, and I'll show you the related film footage. Okay, so here, Arwen is seen by Frodo in Rivendell and is very pretty. Oh, and here, she and Elrond leave the hall after dinner. And here, Bilbo tells Aragorn that he missed Arwen at dinner. Riveting stuff, Melanine. They didn't even have dinner in the movie, so sadly none of that was adapted.
Dinner? Supper? He knows about them, doesn't he?
Oh, and I love this bit. When Arwen looks at Frodo and he feels like his heart was pierced. That sounds more like her grandma here, but perhaps this scene works. And the next time we hear about her is 600 pages later, when Aragorn arrives at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, carrying a standard that Arwen made. In the movies, she didn't personally reforge the shards of Narsil into Anduril, but she did oversee it, so I'm gonna say that's pretty similar. Prepping her man for battle. And finally, we get this scene, which is pretty close in the movies, except Frodo says this. I suppose that would have felt out of place for him to say, but it is an interesting note on which to finish the large-scale part of the story.
You bow to no one.
So that's it. That's all of Arwen's scenes. In terms of agency, she has none, and is, well, it seems rude to call her a sexy lamp, but I would say she isn't even that. Aragorn has a lot of things to motivate him, and while Elrond specifies that Arwen will only marry him if he is king of Arnor and Gondor, she is not exactly set up as a prize for him to be trying to win. Since this is all from Frodo's perspective, it's more like how you would describe meeting an acquaintance's fiancé, like, oh look, there she is, I'm glad he found someone, but nothing really beyond that. If you ask me to rate her role in the books, it is almost non-existent. Removing mention of her would change absolutely nothing, except I suppose Aragorn might not sing that one song about Luthien Thunuviel, which is a banger, of course. And I know you're gonna be like, but Anne, what about the appendices? Okay, fine. Let's look at Appendix A, Part 5. It's only about 5 pages and starts with Aragorn's birth. So there's a lot about him. When he's 20, Elrond tells him his true identity, and then he meets Arwen in the woods. This scene is not directly adapted, but the two of them are clearly remembering it in this scene. Aragorn calls it a dream, which comes up again in the movies.
This is a dream.
Importantly, this is the only spoken lines from Arwen in the story, and honestly, I like her. Aragorn is all besotted, and she's pretty frank with him that she is not a dream, but is a real person, so that's nice. Elrond calls Aragorn to him, and they have a discussion, much like this one.
Let her take the ship into the west. She belongs with her people.
Elrond specifies that Arwen is not interested in Aragorn because he is a yearling shoot next to a young birch. Among elves, this is a devastating burn. Then, when Aragorn is 49, Galadriel dresses him up like an elf lord, and he meets with Arwen again in Lothlorien, and she decides, yeah, it'll do. We get this version of the conversation here.
You said you'd bind yourself to me.
It is mine to give to whom I will.
The appendix continues up through their respective deaths, which is pretty accurately shown here, including direct lines, such as,
You will still have to taste the bitterness of mortality. It's there, it will be evergreen.
But never more than memory.
There is no ship now that can bear me hence.
An image of the splendor of the kings of men in glory, undimmed before the breaking of the world. And there will be no comfort for you, as nightfall in winter that comes without a star, bound to your grief under the fading trees.
Anyway, I aim to please, so that was the appendix. Did it add to her character? Yeah, she got some lines and showed herself to be a strong and proud elf woman. But the choice to marry Aragorn is not really shown from her perspective, and is discussed around her instead of to her.
I will not leave my daughter here to die.
Therefore, now we will finally talk about the movie. Of the scenes that were adapted directly, such as this conversation with Elrond and these with Aragorn, she has more lines, and the importance of the choice being hers is much more evident.
I would rather share one lifetime with you than face all the ages of this world alone.
That choice is yet before her.
I have made my choice. If I leave him now, I will regret it forever. This was my choice.
While in the books, it's more of a foregone conclusion. And what about what was added? Well, obviously her role in Fellowship of the Ring was wholly new, taking the place of Glorfindel. That elf was never mentioned again, so I'm sorry to anyone who was a huge fan of such a random character, but
I don't believe you.
it makes sense to give her more screen time and to establish her presence in the story. So having her show up like this, it tells the audience that elves are otherworldly and that she is more skilled even than Aragorn, the coolest person we've met so far. He looks worried, sure, but not enough to stop her.
Right hard. Don't look back.
It is also a great idea to have her be the first elf that we meet, showing us their power as well as her own. But what I especially appreciate is that she is not introduced as an action girl, which would certainly be out of character. It is perhaps outside of the norms that Tolkien established for her to be out here on her own.
Take her by the safest road.
But she isn't there to fight, she is there to offer aid and rescue Frodo. She flees with him instead of battling the Nazgul.
Naralim, Asfaloth, Naralim.
And so this can be added into her established character more easily than if she, say, joined them on Weathertop, or, joined the Fellowship, or whatever. Now, YouTube didn't exist at the time, but I was on the internet way back then, and some people, henceforth referred to as humorless Tolkien purists, did object strenuously to her taking Glorfindel's place. So let me just say that including a more expanded role for her was necessary, because movies are a very different medium from books. Books allow for a certain level of self-insertion that is impossible in a movie. When I read Fellowship of the Ring, I am on the journey with them, even if I don't relate to any of the characters specifically. When I watch it, I will be just an observer unless I am invited to participate by relating to one of the characters. That's why so many movies in genre fiction have a relatively blank, everyman character, while books can get away without it. I would say Frodo himself is much more a blank slate in the movies than in the books, for example. And from a filmmaking perspective, movies above a certain budget are designed to appeal to a larger audience. And that includes having at least a couple of female characters for the ladies. The only woman with a character arc in the books is Arwen, and she doesn't show up until the second movie, so we gotta do something. And being like the book with Arwen occasionally in the background and then showing up to marry Aragorn at the end would raise some eyebrows, putting her more firmly in the role of a trophy. Thus, she needed some screen time, and taking over for Glorfindel is a great place in the story to include her when putting her in other scenes would not have worked as well. I think they kept the soul of the character intact, emphasizing her otherworldly beauty and not giving her unexpected combat skills, which would have downplayed the importance of Éowyn's journey, as I'll discuss in a future video. She is powerful because she is an elf, and her role in the film is in protection and in counsel.
You are Isildur's heir, not Isildur himself.
All of which makes sense as her father's daughter.
They will answer to the King of Gondor.
And this scene is really the only addition. Most of her appearances in the subsequent films are conversations that are at least heavily based on Appendix A, and all of those have the essential theme of her choices being paramount, something that is lacking from the book.
I choose a mortal life.
So I think she is vastly improved from her book counterpart in a way that does not change her into a different character entirely. She may have taken this job from Glorfindel, but she did not become an elf lord in the process. So yeah, they did a great job adapting Arwen from the books to the movies without changing her significantly. There was at some point in the process an idea of having her lead the elves to Helm's Deep instead of or with Haldir, but that was cut, and I think for the best. It would not fit with her established role, and it would then be strange if she didn't fight in other battles. So that would probably have strayed too far from the source material. Though I would be interested to know how it fit into her character arc. Something that movie Arwen has, that book Arwen didn't, so let's get into that. Now, let's talk about Arwen's character arc and the journey she goes on. As usual, I will be using The Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch as the framework for this discussion. More information on it is provided in the link below. The first step of the heroine's journey is to separate from the feminine, to leave the safe space and start on the journey. For Arwen, you could argue that this is her leaving Rivendell in search of Aragorn and the hobbits in the wilderness. As we see in later films, this is certainly a step outside of her usual situation and shows how she, like everyone else, is having to make important choices in the face of Sauron's rise. The second step is usually for the heroine to join with some male characters who help her through the next steps of her journey. This one doesn't really fit with Arwen, but Aragorn and Frodo could arguably fill this role, even if neither are especially helpful to her. The subsequent steps have more of Aragorn than Frodo, so let's agree that Aragorn is her masculine ally. The Road of Trials is when the heroine faces external threats that have little to do with her internal journey. In this case, that would be rescuing Frodo and fleeing back to Rivendell, including taking a stand against the Nazgul and trying to save Frodo from succumbing to his wounds.
Frodo, don't give in. Not now.
While these are very important to the story itself, they have little bearing on Arwen's emotional journey, which is what the rest of the scenes develop. The next step is the illusion of success, where the victory in the Road of Trials is eventually proven false. You could argue that Arwen's illusion of success is defeating the Nazgul here. Obviously, they come back in a big way. But I think this scene is a better illustration of this step. Arwen speaks with Aragorn about his impending quest and makes it clear what she is choosing to do. She has known Aragorn since he was a young man, like 50 years ago, and had been waiting for him to take up his own journey to fulfill his birthright. And now he is finally starting on that path. She assures him of her faith in his success,
Amen.
and is ready for all they hope for to come to pass. Except Aragorn takes leave of her and makes it clear that she should not wait for him.
It was a dream, Arwen. Nothing more.
He tells her that, as an elf, she should leave this place and go to Valinor instead of hoping that he will be successful against such odds. She's clearly devastated, putting her in the fifth step, spiritual aridity.
It was a gift.
The descent is when the heroine reaches her lowest point in the story, followed by making an important decision. For Arwen, it is when she is speaking to Elrond and sees the future. With Aragorn's cold leave-taking and Elrond's foresight,
there is nothing for you here. Only death.
She decides to give up her choice and go to the Grey Havens after all. The next step is urgently yearning to reconnect to the feminine. This is when the heroine begins to be firm in her own choices and to reclaim something of herself. Arwen does that here when she has a vision of her son, something I will talk more about in the next section, but this changes everything for her.
You saw there was a child. You saw my son.
Even when Aragorn passes away, she will still have a family here.
I looked into your future and I saw death.
There is also life.
So she rejects the counsel of her masculine allies, Aragorn and her father,
Mother, whether by your will or not,
and decides not to doubt what she wants anymore.
if I leave him now, I will regret it forever.
The following steps are all about healing, something very important to Tolkien that will come up when I talk about Éowyn in a future video. So one important way that Arwen heals things is the fact that she does marry Aragorn, healing a rift between men and elves.
Men. Men are weak. Manani Estel Ledain.
It is also kind of a passing of the torch, as elves give up Middle-earth to the humans, with Arwen passing on the lineage of the Eldar, which had been fading.
The line of kings failed. The rule of Gondor was given over to lesser men.
Now come the days of the king.
That is a symbolic step, but Arwen also heals the split within herself. As Frodo says,
You cannot always be torn in two.
she chooses Aragorn and lets go of her kin.
This was my choice. There is no ship now that can bear me hence.
The penultimate step of the journey is to make peace with the masculine. Now, as I said, she does not really have masculine allies, except for Aragorn, so she must make peace with him. He did, after all, kind of break up with her.
It was a dream, Arwen.
In order for Arwen's character arc to be completed, he has to know that she didn't give up on them. And that comes from Elrond going to him with Anduril and telling him,
I come on behalf of one whom I love.
unfortunately for Arwen's journey, she doesn't actually get to take part of this step, and it happens wholly to other people. I'm not necessarily saying they should have had her here instead of Elrond, though in the books it was her brothers, not her father, so it wouldn't be impossible, and why is this cloaked figure so shrouded in secrecy if it's just Elrond after we saw Arwen in this cloak? But alright, whatever. It is a shame that they adapted this scene from the book to, again, just have Arwen be talked about instead of getting to speak for herself. The journey ends when the heroine integrates the masculine and the feminine to become a whole person. That happens here, when she is at last going to get what she wanted all along.
If Sauron is defeated and Aragorn made king and all that you hope for comes true.
To marry Aragorn and become queen. Her father is there to give her away, and she leaves behind her people to bring the grace of the Eldar to Gondor. So that's nice. To be honest, I did not expect to be able to go through the journey with her. She is such a minor character in the book and only really appears as a significant part in the first movie, so I fully expected to just talk about her costumes or whatever, which I do have a lot to talk about, so there's a post linked in the description if you want to know. But I think it is pretty impressive that the filmmakers took such a tiny role and fleshed it out into a character arc, even if it is not a huge one. That's really cool, and certainly one reason I've always loved the trilogy. But the question is, does her character arc fully revolve around Aragorn? Well, let's get into that. Alright, for the final section, we're going to talk about if Arwen is indeed more than a love interest. Normally this is just a brief closing section, but Arwen is a special case because her role may have been expanded, but still has little to do outside of Aragorn. So let's get into that.
You said you'd bind yourself to me.
First, what does Arwen do in the trilogy? What meaningful impact on the plot does she have? The initial one is easy. It was originally the role of another character, so did not specifically have much to do with Aragorn. Arwen arrives to rescue Frodo and bring him to her father before he becomes a hobbit wraith or whatever, which of course has a huge impact on the plot. Without this, who knows what might have happened to Frodo in the ring, so that's a positive point there. Okay, good so far. What's next? Well, she counsels Aragorn when he has doubts about his ability to complete the quest.
You will face the same evil, and you will defeat it.
And while this would definitely fall into the love interest category, I do think it improves her role in that regard, even if it has no definitive impact on Aragorn. Like, I don't think he'd just wander in the woods and never be seen again if she weren't there, but it does better define their relationship and make us root for it. So, what else does she do in the films? The only other thing I can think of is that her conversations with her father also lead to meaningful change. Because of her, the shards of Narsil are reforged and brought to Aragorn as Anduril, which, as I said before, seems like a better role for her than her father, giving her something more active to do without being warlike, and also allowing us to see their relationship progress at this important moment for Aragorn. Instead, they talk about her, and she's dying for some reason.
The light of the even star is failing.
So let me take a brief tangent here to say that being a love interest is never a problem. Love stories are great. The issue comes from, one, the main character generally being male, and so women are only seen as the love interest, and two, the stakes being high for every other aspect of the story, but she is just hanging out and waiting to be kissed at the end. If you're talking about a rom-com, for example, being a love interest often means having as much or more agency than the protagonist. Being in an action movie often means being a damsel in distress or a sexy lamp, which is the problem. The love story does not even let us see her perspective, let alone give her any other impact on the plot. As I said before, Arwen in the books is not exactly just window dressing for Aragorn, but she isn't much more than that. That does get into Tolkien's writing style as an epic, of course, so let's go back to the movies. Showing us Arwen and Aragorn's relationship and how they support each other is a definite improvement from the books, where she's just that lovely person over there. That's good, that makes sense, but it does not mean that she is more than a love interest, only that she is one who is better fleshed out.
This was my choice.
Now, there are two main points of drama from her as a love interest. First, there is the fact that she is rejected, and whether they will get back together is not certain.
Some things are certain.
Well, it's at least played for drama, with her apparent impending death now another obstacle to their relationship.
Arwen is dying.
And the second point is Éowyn setting up a sort of love triangle. The promotional campaign had images like this, for example, but I find that strange because at no point does it seem like Éowyn and Aragorn will actually end up together.
It is but a shadow and a thought that you love.
Like, that looks fairly one-sided. And while Aragorn has told Arwen to leave him, he doesn't really seem to be courting Éowyn as a logical potential for the open Queen of Gondor position. Like, he's nice to her, sure, but he seems more struck by her being in peril than her being a potential partner.
I wished you joy since first I saw you.
So I find both of these points to be weird additions. For Éowyn, she was smitten by him in the books as well, so they more or less played that straight in this adaptation. But her character introduction is pretty heavily based on him, with this flirty sword fight and all.
You have some skill with a blade.
More than it is in the books. I'll talk about Éowyn in her own video and we'll get into this more, but Éowyn's regard is made more obvious, and that seems like an odd choice to emphasize because it confuses our goodwill for Arwen and Aragorn ending up together with our sympathy for Éowyn's choices.
She is sailing to the Undying Lands with all that is left of her kin.
maybe that's just me and I am easily confused and dismayed by love triangles, so let's get back to the other thing, which is actually more confusing to me if I'm being honest. I tried to find out what the filmmaker said about why
Arwen is dying.
but basically no one has cleared that up in the last 20 years, so if you know, please tell me in the comments. Basically though, Arwen gives up her grace here to Frodo,
What grace is given me?
whatever that means. Then she tells Aragorn,
I choose a mortal life.
so far so good, but then what happens?
The life of the Eldar is leaving you.
Which might be a shock, but Elrond's brother also chose a mortal life, so he shouldn't be this alarmed if it's a normal reaction. He says,
Arwen's life is now tied to the fate of the ring.
but isn't everyone's? Why her more than the rest of the elves? Or the men? Though maybe saying she's dying is an overstatement. Maybe she's just super depressed to suddenly be struck with all the realities of being mortal. And you know what? Same. Who hasn't felt like this sometimes? But my point is that Arwen starts the story as a capable and active participant, helping the ring bearer and being able to evade a number of Nazgul on her own. And then the second movie outlines the weighty choice she made and fleshes out her relationship with her father. Which is great. But then in Return of the King, she's just dying of sadness. What is this, Star Wars? Since this really isn't explained otherwise and has no bearing on anything else, I kind of wish we would have just left it here. She oversees the sword being forged, and you know what? It would have been fine to get nothing else from her until she's at the coronation. I don't think this adds anything to the other characters or to the larger plot, and it certainly undercuts the strong character they had built her up to be. They took this basic non-entity and fleshed her out in a meaningful way, but then tripped at the finish line. She's essentially fridged here and just happens to come back for the happy ending. And I just want to emphasize that this bit is disappointing because otherwise she's extremely feminine, but in a positive way. The negative aspects of character writing that often accompany such a feminine character are absent here, or actually undone. I want to finish this section by talking again about the only good part she has in Return of the King, when she sees her son. First, I want you to think about the last time you saw a lady make a significant choice for her son when the son is not a main character. I will talk about this in my Elizabeth episode about how this scene is a much more positive thing for Will than it is for Elizabeth. Generally in films, when a male character sees their children, he sees his legacy. When a female character has children, it is because they are going to be the next chosen one, or whatever. But Arwen sees her son as her legacy, not as Aragorn's legacy. We don't see him become king, we see him playing with his dad. We see Aragorn as a parent, and she wants to be part of that. Having a child, not an heir, is important enough to her that she disobeys her father and calls him out.
You saw there was a child. You saw my son.
Deciding to give up her immortality once and for all because she wants to be a mother. And that's huge. I literally can't think of another female character who desires to be a mom, not just as a plot contrivance to get us to her important kid, but because that's what she wants.
There is also life.
Feminine characters are so often framed as negative that it is a huge deal for her to be one of the most feminine characters I've seen, and her biggest character arc moment has so much to do with her feminine traits. It's very refreshing, even now. So, in terms of being a love interest, she is one, but it is this scene, more than say this one, that really elevates her into being her own character. The filmmakers may have made one major misstep with expanding her role, but this one really works. So, is Arwen more than a love interest? Probably, but definitely a much better love interest here than in the books, with actual agency and choices in the relationship.
I have made my choice.
And we get to see her perspective on her own future. They got off to a strong start with her, but kind of floundered on ways to include her in the rest of the story. I don't think she should have joined them on the journey, and it was a good idea to have flashbacks of her and Aragorn, and to cut to presumably simultaneous scenes of her with her father. But after she takes the stand about staying with Aragorn because of the vision of her son, we really don't need to add drama to their story. There's enough drama elsewhere, and we can be worried about their happy ending along with everyone else's. But there is one more thing to tip the scales in her favor. First, if you look on YouTube, it is pretty easy to find a list of things that happen in Lord of the Rings. In the appendices, in the Silmarillion, what happens after it, what mythologies it references, and so on. Lore, basically. But there is more to a story than the lore. What is Lord of the Rings about? What is the point of the story? Why do we watch it? What makes it appealing? There are themes from the book that didn't make it onto the screen, or at least were not emphasized there, but one major theme exists in both versions of the story: the importance of hope in the face of despair. When all seems lost, you can build a pyre for your son who is not dead, or you can ride out to meet your end because it will inspire your niece to destroy a Nazgul.
I am no man.
Sorry, I'll get back to that when I talk about Éowyn later, but I bring this up because, well, listen to some of Arwen's dialogue.
But it is not lost.
Frodo, don't give in. Not now.
I do not fear them. There is also life.
Why do you linger here when there is no hope?
There is still hope.
Arwen is not the only person to talk about hope and perseverance, of course, but I think the percentage of her lines that are about those things is pretty significant. So yeah, Arwen has a character arc, and she does have things to do without being wholly dependent on Aragorn. She's a solid character. But I think what really makes her memorable and elevates her in the story is that she is the mouthpiece for the theme of the tale. More than anyone else, she embodies what the movies are about. And giving her that role makes her still be one of the greatest female characters we've had the pleasure of seeing in at least the last 20 years.
There is still hope.
Alright, thank you for listening to me talk about my favorite trilogy. Next time, for real this time, I will be continuing the series on Disney princesses and talking about Belle. Please like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all the things so you don't miss it. See you then.